Hi everyone, thank you for attending our webinar today. The presentation is being brought to you by the Society of California Archivists Education Committee. My name is Christine Kim and my co-hosts are Marie Silva and Marlena Christensen. Thank you for joining us for our ongoing series of web-based webinars, workshops, and training sessions offered through SCA. Today's session will be focusing on Tell Us How You See It, Thinking Critically Through a Living Archive for Student Activism. I'd like to introduce our presenters. Tamara Rhodes is the librarian for psychology, cognitive science, human developmental sciences, and linguistics at the UC San Diego Library. She is also the designer and project lead for the Tell Us How You See It, a Living Archive project, a living archive of student activism at UC San Diego. Previously, she was an online learning librarian at East Carolina University. Her research interests are information literacy instruction, user experience, change management, leadership development, and EDI in libraries. Tamara received a BA in sociology from Meredith College and an MLS from North Carolina Central University. She was a 2012 ALA Spectrum Scholar, participated in the Minnesota Institute for Early Career Librarians, and is a current ARL Leadership and Career Development Program Fellow. Cristela Garcia Spitz is the Digital Initiatives Librarian at the UC San Diego Library and collaborates across areas of the library, campus, and community on projects to ensure the long-term accessibility, use, and preservation of the university's unique collections. Content such as images from the Oceanography and Baja California collections, experimental recordings from the Department of Music, and a range of material from the Melanesian Archive are freely available in UC San Diego's digital collections website. For the Tell Us How You See It project, she worked with the team on the submission process, timeline, and technical infrastructure for the physical and digital exhibit. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping points. During the presentation, we are going to mute your lines. If you have questions along the way, please send them through the questions box to all participants. We'll collect these for a Q&A session with the presenters at the end of the presentation. We will be recording today's session and we'll be circulating a link to all of you after today. So let's get started.
There we go. Okay, is my screen showing now?
Yeah, it's pretty
good. Okay, good. All right, well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today as we talk about our concept and the Tell Us How You See It project. So to get started, as questions, conversations, and debates around social justice come to the surface on college campuses around the country, what roles do libraries play? This presentation will discuss a project called Tell Us How You See It, a living archive. And at the heart of the project was the belief that in our capacity as providers of information, libraries can present a narrative in the hopes of informing their community, starting conversations, and inspiring student action.
Our project took root from the sentiments of students on our campus and offers a critical perspective on how we document and archive student voices. In preparing for this presentation, we took this opportunity to think deeply through how this project has thrived within a space that is not only inherently oppressive, but also structurally unequal as an educational institution. So before we begin, we'd like to introduce ourselves to not only provide a little context to why these issues and this project is so important to us, but to also state our positionality within this work. So I am Tamara Rhodes. I am Black, American. I grew up in a military family, so I've lived all over the US, but primarily in the South. I went to a middle school and high school in a place that had the underground nickname of Colonial Whites. I got my bachelor's degree in sociology from an all-women's private school where I was one of few people of color. Then I got my master's in library science from an HBCU, which is an entirely different experience. And my degree was paid for with scholarships trying to increase the number of historically marginalized groups in librarianship. I've been a librarian for 7 years, 2 in North Carolina, 1.5 at UC San Diego, but in a temporary position, which is during the time we created this project, and then 3.5 in my current position, where I'm actually currently the only Black librarian. And I'm the subject librarian for psychology, cognitive, human developmental sciences, and linguistics.
I'm Cristela Garcia Spitz, and I'm Mexican American. My mother's side was from Germany and immigrated here in the late 1800s. My father's side was from Mexico and came here in the 1930s. I was born and raised in South Texas. I went to a magnet high school in the Rio Grande Valley, which provided a path to college. I did my undergraduate degree in anthropology at Tulane University in New Orleans and my graduate degree at the University of Pittsburgh in library and information science. I've worked at Carnegie Mellon University and Princeton University as a librarian and an archivist before coming to UC San Diego to work in the digital library development program. I collaborate across areas of the library, campus, and community to create content for our digital collections website. I also recently became the curator of our Melanesian archive, which consists of collections primarily from anthropologists that work in the Pacific Islands. As a bicultural woman of color working in a higher education institution and still paying my student loans, I care and I think a lot about the student experience. So we both felt it was also necessary to start off with some thanks and acknowledgement. While Tamara and I are now handling the project, there were two other members at the core of our working group, and we want to thank and acknowledge them. So it's Rachel Myers and Gayatri Singh. There were also many other collaborators and student contributions who helped make this project a success.
And we also felt it was necessary to acknowledge that we, and we're here in San Diego, are guests on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation, and we recognize that we are on Native land. We also acknowledge the Black, Indigenous people of color who were, whether physically or systematically, forced to work this land, forced off this land, or otherwise disadvantaged by those with privilege and therefore power. And we do so because our past informs our present, which is, we see it ever more than ever today, and the repercussions of that past subjugation exist today. So we'd like to start off, anytime I attend personally a learning event or experience, I try and do a reflection beforehand, and I'd like to invite you all to do this with me now and think about these questions on the screen. So what inspired you to attend this webinar? So was it a specific line in our abstract? Are you working on a similar project? Do you want to start a similar project? Are you just curious? And then secondly, what are you hoping to learn? So is there a specific question that you have that you're hoping to get answered through our talk? Do you just want to be inspired? So we'll give you maybe like 30 seconds to think about these questions. And if you have something, maybe you can write them down, type them down. And the second question is going to help guide our Q&A at the end as well. So we'll give you a couple seconds to think about these things. And if you want to share your inspiration, so your answers for number one, please do so. That'd be great. And while you all are thinking, I'll actually point out on our first 3 slides, we've included some of the student artwork that was submitted to our project. So if you've been admiring those, that's what those are, and you'll be able to see them if you watch the recording later. Okay, so now that we're all in the space, we've thought about what inspired us and what we're hoping to learn. Let's get started. So the next slide, Cristela. So I'm going to start with an overview of the project to get you acquainted or reacquainted and make sure that we all understand what the project is and frame everything that way. And then we'll get into the section where we thought more critically about some of the things we do and have done with the project. Cristela is going to outline some of the methods and tools we used during the creation of the Living Archive. And then finally, I'll talk about thinking critically about the project's growth and sustainability. So to start, next slide. Our project started, and our story really started in April 2016, right in the middle of the presidential campaign. And as with on other campuses, a number of Trump chalkings appeared on the UCSD campus in multiple areas, but one of them was near the Raza Resource Centro, which is our Chicano campus community center. As a response, the Black Graduate Student Association and the Graduate Student Association co-hosted a race relations town hall. I had only been working at UCSD for 6 months, and I had a friend who was a grad student and on the board of the Graduate Student Association. And she invited me to attend this town hall, and it was my first introduction into sort of the feelings and incidences that have been happening on campus with students of color. And it really sort of opened my eyes and like got me all in my feelings. And it got me thinking about how can the library support our community, especially during this time. And then what I later learned through this project was that in 2016, it wasn't the first time that the campus was hit with incidences like this. In 2010, which you'll see on a picture on the left, there were escalating racist incidents surrounding a fraternity party designated the Compton Cookout, and it made national news and prompted a federal investigation. So with looking at those two things next to each other, it got us thinking about this concept of forgotten history and how with the nature of college campuses, with students trickling in and trickling out every few years, sometimes the memory of campus events fade. And so I thought it was a perfect combination with my the Living Archive idea. So I'd previously written an article when I was still in library school for the social sciences section of IFLA. And what it talked about was it referenced the New School and their Occupy Wall Street Living Archive and how we could how libraries could take that concept and apply it in order to support, engage, and document social movements in our own communities. So I use the New School format and I sort of translate it to what it might look like for libraries. And the format involves the inclusion of past historical narratives, and it includes present sentiment in the form of creative expression. And then during that time, it also captures up-to-the-minute feedback and commentary. And it's a way that libraries could bridge formats to where everything is collected and presented together to sort of create this singular narrative. And again, it was perfect for UCSD's climate, looking at 2010 and 2016. It was a way that we could like incorporate that past and include what's happening in the present in order for students to be able to feel supported, engaged, and create this center of reflection and a point of dialogue. Next slide, please. So this is what it looks like. So for our project, we had the particular goal of start to finish, we're just going to do an exhibit. And so this is what 3 parts are of a living archive. So you have the historical narrative on the left there, which is we did in the form of banners. And we looked at historical events of campus. We had a singular topic, which is a focus on the history of student activism. And our purpose was to, again, foster and contextualize a conversation about the way students experience UCSD's campus climate. And so with that historical theme that we came up with, and Christella will talk a little bit about that later, we also included current reflections or student perspectives. So we invited students to submit artwork based off of sort of a prompt on that historical narrative. And then finally, with this exhibit standing, we included a space where folks could submit real-time feedback. So you can see we just had a board with a prompt asking folks like how they felt about the theme, about the exhibit itself, anything they wanted to share. And we offered people a way to submit real-time feedback. Yeah, so that's the crux of what our project was. And then talking a little bit about, I call this the dream team. We had a core group of 4 folks who put this all together, but we also had a number of people that helped us create the project and help it make it a reality. And we really like to point out this slide because one, all 4 of us come from different areas of the library. We have different functions and we had different project roles. And then also to show the amount of people and the different areas that people were involved in order to help this project come to fruition. So Additionally, our core working group, as you may be able to see, we come from all diverse backgrounds in different areas of the library. We're multi-generational, different skills and perspectives. And so there's Christella, which you've already been introduced to her. So she was the digital initiatives librarian and worked on the archives and the digital infrastructure advisor. Gayatri Singh, who was a reference and information services coordinator, and she was the liaison advisor and sort of the coordinator. She's amazing at getting things done and making things happen, making events happen. I am a social sciences liaison, and I was the project manager and designer. And then Rachel Myers, who was a library assistant, she was our researcher and copy editor, and she'd been on a campus a long time, and she knew a lot about the campus history and could advise us on that. And she's an amazing copy editor. But in addition to that, we had a liaison to the campus community center, so we were plugged into student groups. We had a rights analyst in our library, so Christelle will talk more about that, but that was very integral to getting the student work. Our library IT services, our special collections and archives, and also collaborating with campus activists and other community members, and I'll talk about that more at the end. So as you can see, the development of the Living Archive required the expertise and collaboration between multiple people and departments in the library and the campus community. And then just a little bit about our timeline, just to sort of like give a context to all of this. So we started planning 9 months out for the initial exhibit. So all of this happened in 9 months. And we also had to consider when we started, as far as like the busy start to the fall quarter and also the holidays coming up. And so if you look at the timeline, the first 4.5 months were just planning. Specifically just planning and making sure, for me, I set up the infrastructure and the documentation and made sure that we had a list of all the people that needed to be included, made sure that they knew about the project and knew what was going on and could give us input if they wanted. And that was really important going forward. And then September to December, we did a call for submissions. Mid-November to January, we did our submission review. So again, that is that holiday. So we took that break in that time, and we did a lot of work on the online collection. We did a lot of work on looking over the submissions and reviewing them and deciding which ones we wanted to include in the exhibit. And then in December, and Christella will tell you more about this, we did a little replanning for the online collection. And then on February 1st, 2017 is when we did the rollout. So we rolled out the physical exhibit in the library and also the online collection. We made that available. And then we also did a panel from Crisis to Change, the student experience and activism on campus. And that panel consisted of 4 folks who were previous student activists, and they also now work on campus. And so they were able to offer that perspective of, oh, we were student activists. They talked a lot about like the issues student activists have, like managing their schedules, like trying to do this sort of like invisible labor of activism, but also keeping up with their schoolwork. And then also what that activism looks like now that they're sort of within the institution. So that was sort of how we rolled out the project in the exhibit. And I'll hand it over to Christella.
Thanks. Okay, let me get set up here. Let's see. So as Tamara mentioned, with this ambitious timeline, we basically had to really cram in a lot in a little bit of time. And so the planning became really important. So I'm going to walk through the submission process in detail and then discuss some of the maintenance and online exhibits and its growth since the initial exhibit. But hopefully some of that planning and thinking will be informative for all of you. And first off, I want to start by talking about how this project really was a culture change for our library. Student voices have a limited representation in our university archives, and they exist in things like the student newspapers, but we really weren't actively collecting in this area. And that's often in a very limited sort of way, like often it's just quotes within the student newspaper. And it's not a typical role for our library to seek submissions. Typically we, sorry, I'm having trouble here. Okay. So in this case, we were looking to gather student work and engage at a level. And so we really had to be very thoughtful about how we provided updates to our library administration and shared the vision of what we were trying to do. We presented the concept, but we actually didn't have enough information to go forward with a formal digital project proposal process. It was really interesting just trying to fill out the form that we use for project proposals, because we really didn't know how many submissions we'd get, what types of submissions we might receive. There really wasn't much to try to document. We just had the concept. So we decided to sort of frame it as this was going to be a pilot project. It's really kind of an experiment, and we all had to sort of accept that and have a sort of we're jumping in spirit as we worked on this project. And I do want to point out that this project approaches and includes critical librarianship. It's really thinking about whose voices are represented in our collections and our archives, how libraries and librarians aren't neutral, and that we can and should engage and support in social movements in our communities. It made it challenging, and it also pushed us to work together across library programs and utilize all of our various expertise and technical skills. So I like to describe it as kind of a well-orchestrated feat when I look back on what we were able to do in that short amount of time. So jumping in and talking about the submission process, the main part of our first initial exhibit was the student perspectives. And so we put out the initial call for submissions in September of 2016 on our library's blog. As Tamara mentioned, we spent a lot of time before that planning and thinking about it. So in our blog post, we are really setting out the parameters. We highlighted 2 specific events, and we were careful about the wording. So again, those events were the event from 2010 and then the more recent event from 2016. And we were careful to define, what a living archive is and highlight that we were looking for submissions from all students. We were also hoping to get a range of student perspectives, not just voices from particular groups, or maybe just perspectives from the extreme sides. So I think it's really important when doing these types of projects to think about framing. So for example, we chose to use the words student experiences related to campus climate instead of saying something like, student experiences about racist incidences on campus. So it's really important to choose your wording and to think about that so that you're not already framing the types of responses that you might get. We did have some requirements. We wanted to focus on current students. So we had undergraduate and graduate students, and we also wanted original works. And we wanted students to abide by the university's principles of community, which states principles and values on dignity and diversity and rejects discrimination. So here I'm showing the later part of the submission form where we're pointing to some of the library's resources. So we have things about copyright, fair use, Creative Commons, plagiarism, and again, those principles of community. And we thought this was important to also reinforce the information that's already available and taught in the library. I'm going to highlight here again that we wanted to point out in multiple places that we wanted things to be free of bias and hate. We were looking for a constructive dialogue, but we were still mindful that this would be displayed in the library, and we wanted to emphasize that the library is a place that is welcome to all. We also knew that we were not going to be able to accommodate all submissions in the physical exhibit, and so and that we weren't going to be collecting the physical artwork after the exhibit was over. So we had to think about how people would submit physical artwork and then how they would be photographed in order to be included in the digital exhibit. Finally, again, we wanted to point to existing library resources. So we linked to information about our digital media lab, our tech blending program, and the digital collections that have already been digitized and made available for our university's 50th anniversary. So we had things like student newspapers, photograph collections from over the years. We also made a point of, so we posted this library blog post and then shared it with all of the subject liaisons, and they were able to share it with their faculty and lecturers. So we did receive over 200 submissions. And we really have to thank, specifically, there were 2 faculty members, Katie Herzog and Amanda Solomon, that integrated this project into their courses as the final assignments. So it was a Viz Arts class and what's called a CAT course. It's Culture, Art, and Technology course. And that really made it, brought in incredible submissions. Okay. And then to talk a little bit more about the submission form, we used JotForm and Dropbox for submissions. So the good thing about JotForm is that it automatically populated to the Dropbox folders. So we could have this form where this is basically where the students would need to go to fill out their information and then upload what they were submitting. We did ask for a student ID and classification just to verify that they were current students, but we didn't use that for anything else. And we actually removed it from the spreadsheets once we exported this information. It was incredibly important to have a preferred email address because if there were any items missing from the submission process, we needed a way to get in touch with the students. Which we did have missing files and sometimes license agreements, which I'll talk about a little bit further. In terms of what we were asking for in the submission, all of this information that we gathered from this form was used both in the physical and the online exhibit. So for example, the information that the student provided, the title of the submission, the information about what it was, their description and motivation for the artwork, all of that became, in the physical exhibit, it became the artwork captions and title cards. In the online exhibit, it became the object metadata. So again, this was ways that we thought through in our planning process to sort of streamline how we would go from this to an online and a physical exhibit. We did have to give some considerations using JotForm in terms of like the amount of entries allowed, the space, the number, and the size of the attachments. It was also nice that JotForm gave us unique ID numbers for each submission, so we were able to keep track of certain things. The one thing we learned from this is that we had a brief bio as a part of the form, and bios were not always filled out correctly by the students. They weren't quite sure what to provide there. So in the future, we have had to think about providing more information about what we would like to have in a bio. And then also, this is showing again more of how they uploaded the process. We also had the option to remain anonymous. We felt that it was important that that be an option so that they could be expressive if they wanted to say what they wanted to say, show what they wanted to show. But I will say in that, if you do that, that's something that you have to think about and account for time. It took time to remove their names and make sure that the content really was anonymous. So sometimes there were drawings that had a signature, or there were essays with details about themselves that might be identifying. And then the other thing that we did do that was important is that we put on the form that we reserve the right to edit the descriptive content for clarity and reformatting. And so again, that's kind of what it was alluding to, that sometimes we had to make certain changes in order to respect their wishes of being anonymous for those submissions. And then this is what our license agreement looked like. We used just our standard license agreement. At the time, I have to say I was a little hesitant to change any of the details on the license agreement since it had kind of been, blessed by campus lawyers. And so it really wasn't tailored for this project. It was just kind of the general standard license agreement. And so this was something that also needed a lot more instructions. Students kind of didn't know what to fill out or how to fill it out. And we had it as a separate PDF that had to be submitted, downloaded, and then submitted. So there were about 50 out of the 261 submissions that we didn't include in the public view because we did not receive the license agreement. And after a few attempts and reminders, we only heard back from about 10 of those 50. And of those 10 there were 10 that were missing content, and we were able to reach out and retrieve some of those. But I will say, having that in your timeline, also thinking about missing items and how to account for getting all the different pieces together was also something that we didn't build in as much time as we probably needed for that. So the submissions did vary. We got students that were very passionate to the students that kind of had sort of like a, I don't care, or it doesn't really mean too much to me, the different sort of things that are happening on campus. And I think that's okay. I think that's actually really important and valuable to have something that's sort of representative of what's happening on campus at the time. And I do think that our framing of campus climate allowed for that range of voices. Sometimes they were critical and sometimes they were celebratory. One thing that stood out for me after reviewing the student submissions was that college is often the first time for individuals to live and be exposed to other cultures. So it was something that really came across in quite a few of the student submissions, where they just had that observation of, you know, they're meeting new people from different parts of the country and the world. And I think that's a really unique aspect that's good to be reminded of. One thing about student submissions to keep in mind is that we really started to realize as we were reviewing them that the majority of the pieces might stand on their own, but for some, the context was really important. So unless you understood what the project was and what the prompt for the project was, it was hard to understand what the piece was. So this is an example where it was a made-up chart kind of making a point about like the makeup and of UCSD, but it's not really actual numbers. So it's really more of just a statement piece. And so we had to think about that when we transferred this to an online exhibit, is how do you provide that thoughtfully and mindfully and have that sort of greater context there. And for some of them, it was a challenge, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. We also had to review the submissions pretty closely. So this is an example of an image that we wanted to use to promote the project. And then through a Google image search, we realized that it was actually posted on Twitter by someone else. And so it might not have been the student submissions photograph. And so again, there's some thinking that goes and is involved in making sure that they're actually original student works. So even though we kind of framed it that way, we did have to make sure and verify before we used certain images. So this is something I wanted to show just as kind of like a planning tool. So from the beginning, we intended to create an online collection. And we knew that that would be important for people who maybe couldn't come see the physical exhibit, and we were hoping that it could live on. But again, we really had to take time to think about how this would translate online. And so this was a document that we used to have a conversation with our IT support. And we were thinking about like what platform, what tool we would need to use early on. And so here you're seeing kind of like a column of what we thought that we needed for the collection, and then each of the different platforms and whether it had it or didn't have it. And this was a really useful tool to have those kinds of conversations. We did have a big curveball in our project timing. We had planned on going with a tool called Knit, which is a WordPress-based tool called Commons in a Box. And I can talk about that a little bit further later. But because of some sort of hiccups, Knit was being transferred from library IT support to campus IT support. We weren't able to actually use it in time for the launch of the exhibit. So we ended up using Ameca, which met most of our requirements in terms of having landing pages, the visual elements, the commenting abilities. And so that's what we had to kind of stand up. We didn't previously have Ameca available at the library, so it was actually starting something as we were using it. So it was a rush. And then the good thing was that there were some advantages to using Omeka in terms of being able to use the CSV import feature and the Dropbox plugin. So we were able to take the spreadsheets that came out of JotForm, do a lot of cleanup, a lot of work in terms of figuring out what we had and what we could put online. And then we were able to upload that into Omeka pretty easily. We also used the timeline spreadsheets, which I'll talk about in a little bit, to also put into Omeka. And so that really facilitated the process and made that sort of streamlined. Although I will say Omeka did work well at first because we really needed to have something ready for the exhibit and the opening event. So Omeka is easy to stand up, but we found it was much harder to maintain. As we started to use Omeka more, we were met with it not being as ideal in terms of like issues of navigation, searching. Everything takes a plugin, and plugins aren't that well maintained. We did have Google Analytics running on our site, and we could see that users were going to the site, but not going much deeper. So we tried to do some fixes in terms of what was on the homepage and how to tell people to get to further content. But we realized that we really were going to need much more of programmer time to do more in terms of the navigation, fixing the search. And so this is another tool that, again, we use to talk to our library IT, just in terms of what the issues that we were facing. And we often do this where we list the issue, we talk with them about what our priority for fixing that issue is, and then what their level of effort is to fix it. And so after kind of working through this, I think we realized that this was just going to be the tool. Omeka would just be the tool for us in the initial part of the project. And then switching gears and talking a little bit about the timeline, creating the timeline. So for the historical narrative part of the Living Archive, we wanted to create this timeline focusing on student activism throughout UCSD's history. But we wanted to make sure that we weren't focused just on moments of conflict, but also on moments of progress. So we also included things like the creation of the cultural centers, having a principles of community established. And one thing that we decided early on to sort of streamline this is we consulted and discussed with different campus partners what to try to include. And then we decided that we were going to also just take direct quotes from our sources. So all four of us team members went through different sources to find quotes and images, and we gathered all of this information into a shared Google spreadsheet. And then that's what we used to create the banners for the physical exhibit and the digital exhibit. So that's what you're seeing here is the way the banners looked. And then what's really great about having that stuff in a spreadsheet form is that we were able to repurpose it again later as we've wanted to move forward with the site into a Timeline.js tool. So again, it's kind of carried us, those spreadsheets have carried us through the different technological shifts that we've had to make. And again, what you're seeing on the timeline is just a direct quote from the source and the source being cited. And then same thing for the images that we used. We just made sure to cite where the images came from. And so that also helped us not have to do so much heavy editing and writing and constructing the timeline. Although I will say that it did help us streamline it, you still have to think about which images you're using. So we were very fortunate at the time that we had hired a temporary rights analyst position to work on a specific collection that had to do with poetry. And so she was in a part of our team at that time, and we were able to kind of bring her in on borrowed time to work with us on our project and to kind of do some rights clearance on the images that we had chosen for the banners. And so for the physical exhibit, we had a little more leeway in terms of which images and sources we used. But when we moved online, we had to think a little bit more about copyright concerns. For example, we knew that there was news sources that maybe we wouldn't want to lean on as heavily as some of our sources, like our student newspapers. So again, it was also one of those things that, you know, was easy to get up, but it's been also a process to maintain it. So at the moment, we have online content up till 2017 exhibit, and we're still working to add the more recent years. So that's something to think about with the timeline too, is the maintenance of it. So I will say, I talked a little bit earlier on about administrative hurdles. So we couldn't do that formal project proposal because we didn't have enough information about what we were going to have and what we were trying to create in terms of digital collection. So it wasn't until after the project was done and over that we went through the formal project proposal process in order to get this content into our digital asset management system and make it available on our digital collections website. So what I'm showing here is kind of that proposal process, and then what it looks like once we have an approved project. Then it gets a formal project plan, and we're able to use sort of like our metadata analyst to work on getting the collection into our digital collections website. So the content is now available in our dams for preservation, and it's also discoverable in our digital collections website. So although it was an interesting sort of process to think about, because we still are challenged that our content and this sort of project doesn't really fit our data model and the ways that we've currently been thinking about stewardship. I think a lot of our digital collections are mostly sort of digitized content that came already from the library's collections. So I'm kind of considering this more of an active collection, which we're starting to have more and more active collections. But we had to really think about how could this display in our existing digital collections website? How could we have the context that we needed? And so what we decided to do is break it into 3 different collections, and that way we could highlight and feature the different aspects a lot easier. But again, it's kind of trying to fit something that doesn't quite fit into this box. And just to go that a little bit further with that, you can see that we're still kind of negotiating where the content should live and how it fits. So this is an example of one of our more recent events. In November 2019, we were a part of a event called Spray Speech, which was hosted on by one of the colleges and organized by ResLife. And so the event really focused on providing information about individual free speech on campus. And so we went to the event and we displayed the timeline, and we asked students for feedback about the timeline. So it was kind of a similar thing where we had a sticky note response for real-time feedback. And so what we've put into our digital collections website is photos from the event and the feedback that we received. But again, this is still kind of experimental of how does it fit into our digital collections website, and what does it look like, and what do people understand what it means, is something that I think we're still having to think through. And then another thing that we're still having to think through is sort of the context. So at the moment, now that the content lives in our digital collections website, it's also available through Callisphere and DPLA. So I think we're still having to figure out, like, how does this translate? How does it? How do people see and understand what they're looking at? And it's actually funny because we've had this slide for a while now in our presentation as sort of like a thinking exercise, but it's only after this summer that we moved our content into the digital collections website that we really now can sort of look at what our content looks like in DPLA. And so I think there's still a lot of things that we need to think through. We've also joined Project STAN, which is a national consortium of more than 40 colleges and universities creating an online hub to heighten access to digital and analog archival and historical collections documenting student activism. So again, we're going to have to think about what context means with these aggregate sites. And then finally, this is just what our Tell Us How You See It website looks like. So we went ahead and migrated the content off of Omeka earlier this year and into Knit, which is what I mentioned earlier. It's a WordPress-based tool that's called Commons in a Box and was developed by CUNY. And it basically has WordPress features, and then it also has some collaborative tools like discussion boards and things like that on the back end. And so we're really excited about being able to use this tool and think about things differently. We've been able to think a lot more about how we present the project and the narrative and the flow. And so it'll be interesting to see how we're able to move forward with it in this form. And with that, I am going to pass it back to Tamara.
All right. So as you've seen and heard from our descriptions of the project itself and the methods and tools that Christella shared, we found ourselves creating and engaging during the creation of the project, trying to figure out a home for the online collection. And we took a lot of time and thought into doing all these things. And so the last thing we want to share is just as we've been thinking critically about the project itself, we want to share what we've learned and thinking in the sustainability of the project, share some sort of ingredients for success that we've come up with and some critical questions that we're still considering. So in thinking about project growth, the main, next slide please. The main thing that has helped us tremendously is a focus on partnerships and partnerships from the very beginning. So in that initial planning stage in May, we were already forming partnerships. And I think they helped our project grow, which I'll show in a minute, but also helped it sustain. So the first lesson in partnerships is to root your project in a community need. So making sure the project has roots in something that's really relevant and making sure, so a lot of times we say that it's based off of a user need or a community need, but it might be, oh, we think the community needs this. But I think what's really sustained our project over time and made it what it is that it was really based off of, we heard from their mouths what the students are struggling with, and sort of like based everything off of that. And that not only helps with the project itself, but also, as Christella talked about, like those administrative hurdles. If we can say that, oh, we know that our community is struggling with this, we know it because of this reason, you can continue, like your project can continue because it's based in your community. And that's what we do in libraries, right? And that's what administration likes to hear, is to make sure that everything we do is for our community. And I think also because the moment that we created it, it tied into the current political atmosphere, and as it has it, like our current political atmosphere now and in 2016. And so at the time, there were a lot of courses being taught around issues of social justice and activism, and they still continue. So our project, because it was rooted in what was happening at the time and in a need, it sustains and it continues because that need is still there, that atmosphere and that climate is still existing. And so as it grows, so the next slide is so cultivating those collaborations and coalitions. So we established it in that need, and we started talking to folks on campus and building those coalitions. So Christella talked about our initial partnerships with the CAT Culture, Art, and Technology course and with the Visual Arts course. And that was how we got our initial submissions. We had over 200, and it was because it was based in a curriculum with a course, and they built it in. And we partnered with the subject librarians for that. So we initially, because I was in the role I was in as temporary instruction librarian, I already had a connection to the Culture, Art, and Technology course. But we sent a message out to our other subject librarians who promoted it. And because of that, our visual arts liaison sent it to her department, and a visual arts course wanted to be involved as well. And so again, creating those collaborations, sharing the project, building coalitions. And then also finally, like the panel I talked about with the 4 different folks from across campus who were former student activists. Again, we were building those collaborations across campus with different communities and building that coalition together. And because of that, the next slide, because we were really intentional with our collaborations and coalitions, so many opportunities came out of that, and opportunities that we didn't really seek, they happened to find us, again, because it was rooted in the need of the community. They saw it and they decided to take it and use it for their own purposes, which is exactly what we wanted. So word of the timeline, which has been the most popular part of it, was the historical timeline got out. And that's the piece that we've been sharing more widely. But initially, so we partnered with the University of California Student Association. We were thinking about this coalition building, and with the panel, there was this idea of forming these coalitions. And so we decided to put together a workshop, also based off of a question from a student in the audience, about how to organize for action. And so UCSA actually had a presentation that they usually did. And so we partnered with them and we created a workshop. I think Crisis to Change, how to organize for action. And we made those materials available on our website. And then again, from that timeline, and because of the panel, we got approached by anthropology classes. And so we would go in and sort of use the timeline as sort of a basis for what our campus climate is and has been, and use that to inform our current environment. And we also would go in and talk about the difficulty of finding information. So because the 4 of us had to put together the timeline, we knew that, oh, you know, our eye was on specific historically marginalized groups. And through our experiences, some of that information we couldn't find. We know it existed because we've heard it on campus, we've heard it from our partners, from our collaborators, but looking into the student newspapers, looking into student records, that was kind of hard to find, and we had to do some digging. So some of these classes we go into, that's a piece of what we teach, is like the intricacies of finding information. We've also, it built up that we started being involved in the resident advisor training for one specific college, the Thurgood Marshall College. And our collaborator there was a member of the panel. And so they were the assistant director of the Res Life for Thurgood Marshall College. So she brought us in to do RA training, again, to lay that groundwork with the history, and so that the resident advisors understand, like, this is the environment the students are coming into. So how do we support the students living in our residence halls if that's the basis for our environment? We also did a teaching assistant training for grad students who were going to be teaching diversity, equity, and inclusion classes. The student newspaper, the Triton, reviewed our exhibits. What else? Our exhibit was mentioned in American Libraries, and it was also in an article in the Journal of American Ethnic History. And again, so this kind of acknowledgement from different groups and groups outside of the campus also sort of, in my opinion, because it was rooted in that environment and the climate, those kinds of things that happened outside of what we thought lended itself to the legitimacy of what we were doing. Most recently, we worked with our Teaching and Learning Commons, so they were really interested in their staff and how their staff supports EDI initiatives. And so again, we went in and we talked about what we learned about campus climate from student reflections and from digging into the history. We also did, so we started in that RA training for one college. Well, because of that, this past summer, they actually did RA training again, but our project was included for the training for all 6 of our colleges. So it kind of like grew on its own. And then we also were involved, we worked with one of the colleges for an RA student-led event, which was a commentary on free speech. And so again, the students are seeing the project and thinking about how it plays into what they're grappling with at the moment. So in this case, it was free speech. And they invited us to come display the banners and sort of share the project, which was really great. And all of these things, again, we don't really promote the project. It's just that people find out about it, it's word of mouth, and they bring us in and ask us to present. And then finally, talking about sort of branching out. Next slide, please, Christella. So branching out for further growth. So now that we're sort of reaping the benefits of those rewards of that initial structure that we put in, we're thinking about how the project is branching out and how we can branch out even more. So we thinking about things that we didn't expect the project to be involved in. The Graduate Student Association actually brought us in for the 75th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education. And we did an entire event where we, the library hosted a film screening in one of our larger rooms. We hosted panels, but also we displayed the timeline in the context of Brown versus the Board of Education and thinking about like educational institutions and equities in education and how the history of the campus plays into that. And also one of my departments as a liaison was celebrating the creation of the first equity and inclusion specialization for their major. And so we use the exhibit again, and we engage folks with changing up the prompts to the real-time feedback. So every time we do classes, every time we do these events, we always have some kind of prompt and we allow real-time feedback and we put those entries into the collection and that becomes a part of growing the collection. And it's a way for folks to see how they can see our project embedded into whatever they're doing and how they can sort of use it in their own personal activism and increasing their awareness. And then thinking about branching out, we'll talk a little bit more about this in the critical questions portion, but we're thinking about how we move forward. So one of the big questions is how do we make it even more student-led and sort of essentially like giving the project over to students. And so we're thinking about those things as we're thinking about branching out further. So the next thing I want to share is thinking about ingredients for success. So I know a lot of folks, and I saw some of your questions, a lot of folks are saying like, oh, we want to start a project like this. We've had people reach out to us about starting a project. And so in thinking critically about our project, I came across this book, Tactical Urbanism for Librarians. And when I read it, it's sort of like light bulbs were going off all over the place because a lot of the things that are present in this book were things that our project included just naturally. And it's because, again, we did all of those things with partnerships and coalitions. And so it sort of helped me reframe everything that we were doing and to set ingredients for success. So in thinking about that, so part of the summary of this book is Tactical Urbanism is a global grassroots movement to improve cities by and for the people who live in them. And it has applications that are tailor-made for libraries. And so again, the reason why this book was so transformative when I came across it was because within the components of this movement, I saw elements of our plan. We sort of accidentally created our project in a way that aligns. So thinking about understanding the context and need, I already talked about that, about making sure that it's rooted in a community need. Thinking about constraints, goals, and a team. So when we first formed the team, one of the first things we did was we talked about what we wanted and what might be a factor that it wouldn't happen. So we talked about all the contingencies. So who might be a sticking point? What department might be a sticking point? In what ways can we sort of like transform the way we present this in order for them to understand our goal and see it as an asset to them as well? We thought about all those things in that initial planning. For collaborative design process, the creative path to procurement and the communications plan. So again, like even beforehand, I set up a dashboard for us and we talked about, we met regularly and we discussed, so who needs to be involved? Who are the influential and knowledgeable people on campus? What are some creative ways to design and communicate our project so that it wouldn't hit up against those barriers? And so I used to say that we found ways around things, but I don't like saying that anymore because I think it pulls up short of what we actually did. What we actually did was we were very strategic about our language, who we got involved, how we presented it. It was all strategy. And again, that 4.5 months of planning really was the crux of this project. So having a flexible implementation plan and funding. So from the beginning, we planned with the idea that we would use resources that we already had access to and that we would need to be flexible in case things came up. And so some of that you can see in the spreadsheet that Christella shared, how we communicated with IT. So we really thought about, at the bare bones of it, how do we want this information to be displayed? And then, so we weren't tied to a product. We were focusing on what did we want in order to display this, and then how can we get that out of whatever we needed to use. So we were very flexible. And then with the last three, measurement and evaluation, stewardship and maintenance plan, and then follow-up. We are now in the stage, we continue to be, and we're thinking through where we'd like to go based on the interest that has come up on campus already, and that's been presented to us. And that's the phase that we're in right now. So next slide. The other element that stood out to the book was how to create a climate to support change. Next slide, Christella, please. Oh, Christella, are you still there? Okay.
Yeah, I'm there. Did it show up?
No.
Do you want, let's see.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. So thinking about, so in order for these things to happen, you need to create a climate of support. And how do you do that? So again, we turn back to the elements, and these are the things that we keep repeating. Sorry, previous slide. And I'm going to keep repeating it because it was so important to our project, which was align it with the community and align it with a community contact or a community collaborator. So that is very, very important. So can you go back to the previous slide, Christella?
I think there's a delay. I'm on the critical
okay.
questions. Is that right?
No, I'm on the climate for support.
Okay, let's see.
Technical difficulties.
Sorry.
No, don't apologize. It happens. I can almost guarantee that everybody in this webinar has had experience with this. All right, I'll keep going and maybe it'll get there. So one of the things was agency leader support. So for this project, I was very clear, especially, so again, when I created this, I was still a temporary librarian. So I had a 2-year position. I had only been there like a year and a half. I was very clear about aligning it with our institutional, thank you, with the institutional and the library mission, vision, and goals. So the project started as something a course was using, and it was built into their assignment, which instruction is something that we already do. So again, you can see the theme here is like build it into what you're already doing, and then it has less of a chance that it'll be taken away or that it'll fail. And so I also aligned it with my personal job responsibilities. So again, I was temporary, but because there was this element of instruction in it, and we were working with one of the colleges, it was tied to my job position. When I moved into becoming a liaison, not only could I align it with the instruction, but it also became aligned with the outreach piece. And so a lot of questions that came up in the beginning was who would take responsibility for the project? And so by aligning it with these different pieces, I was able to say, oh, well, the department that I'm in can take responsibility because it's an outreach tool. All of these classes are coming to us. So it was a method of outreach. And for my own personal position, it's also instruction that we're doing. So again, this really helped create that climate to support the change. And now, so we found out recently that, I guess recently, maybe like a year or so, now they're having these EDI goals on campus, and each campus unit is required to submit what they're doing to support EDI on campus. And so actually our UL, in the beginning, unbeknownst to us, used our project as an example of what the library is doing for EDI. So again, like we built it initially around this community need, and it's sort of taken on its own and becoming intertwined in our jobs, in our departments, in the campus, in the library and the institution. And a lot of that happened outside of us because we had that good foundation. And then lastly, for the collaborative process, and I mentioned this before, do this early and often to gain buy-in. And it was incredibly important for us to communicate with others in a way that they understand and a way that matters to them. So again, like we're very cognizant of the language that we used, when we brought people in. So we knew that if we didn't have enough information, this person might not be on board. So we waited till later on so we had more information. So again, we were very, very strategic, and it paid off. And then the last piece, next slide, please. The last piece from this book is the way that we rolled out the project. And so in tactical urbanism, the iterative approach can be the key. And it just so happens that that's the approach we took. So demonstration, in the first few days and months, we were unsure of how the project took shape. So we were very flexible, and we were ready for any challenges that might come. And we also had to create proposals and run it by a lot of people. And we collected data along the way to refine our approach. So in the beginning, we had a very extensive project page where I kept track of everything. We had task lists. I kept track of who we contacted, their contact information. I even included emails, so documentation is very key. So if we sent an email asking permission to use Tell Us How You See It, because it was previously used for a campus initiative, their response, I made the email into a PDF, attached it to this project page. So we would have that in case anything came up later. And so our project, the exhibit and the panel, was a pilot. And so we built it as a pilot. And so now we're in the interim design phase. So Christella talked about us working on the website and trying to figure those things out. So again, we're being flexible. And as courses come up, as people sort of decide for us how they want to use the project, we're redesigning and we're figuring out how these things work. And so we've had another run of the exhibit where we updated the timeline so we're up to 2017 right now. And we try to match the exhibit and what pieces we include to the community event that we're being a part of. And so long term, what we're looking for, we want to do like a stable site. We want to figure out how it lives beyond us. And this is what goes into our critical questions, which is the last piece of this. So the larger question is, so how do passion projects move beyond those that started it for others? And how does it live beyond just us who create it? So can we still shape and steer it, or do we need to let it go for the sake of growing it into something else, perhaps more sustainable? These are all things we're asking. So we're asking ourselves, like, where do we go from here? How do we make the project more student-centered? So we've kicked around ideas of how do we get students involved, and how do we sort of give it over to them to even take more control of what this looks like? How do we do that and still be cognizant of the fact that, you know, students are only here for 4 years? So how do we create a pipeline of students? These are all questions we're kicking around. Also, what does it mean for this to be a living archive? So again, my initial paper on this it was an art exhibit from the New School, and they were constantly shifting their space day to day. But for our historical piece, are we going to update every time something happens? We've decided not. We've decided that we feel like the events need time to breathe. So when something happens, you know, things happen quickly. So if we posted something right when it happened, it might be that the next minute, the next day, the next week, the next month, there might be something that's a response to that. So we've decided to sort of build in some time for things to breathe before we update the archive, especially thinking about students and the way they work. And someone had a question earlier about social media events. So in my initial paper, it includes including social media. But again, thinking about how quickly events unfold. And also we had conversations about the fact that folks post things in the moment as their initial feelings. And do we want to catalog those in perpetuity for these initial like gut feeling events? And so we're still thinking about those things and considering, but I think what we've decided is about like letting things breathe, and we'll talk a little bit more about that maybe in the Q&A. And then the last piece is how does this remain a living archive? Not just, is it just with us? Is it with other people? And how do we continue to grow it and sustain it? So yeah, I think that's it for us, and we'd love to hear your questions. So going back to those initial reflections, if you were hoping to learn something that we didn't cover, we'd love to hear those questions. If you have other questions that came up about our processes, our methods, how it came about, we'd love to hear what you have for us.
Thank you both so much. This is Marie Silva. I'm one of our co-hosts, and if you have any questions, please do ask them via the questions pane, and I will relay them to Tamara and Christella. And Tamara, I just wanted to circle back and read some of the responses to your initial reflections. I have here, one of our attendees said, I'm here for inspiration as a scholar and educator. Another said, I'm doing a similar project at a community college. And then a third said, they're thinking about a similar project and dealing with a lot of stuff in Instagram.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. I think especially now with, the world events, the racial reckoning, all these things happening, folks are wanting to do a lot more projects that are similar. So I think Christella and I both are hoping that people can learn from what we learned and learn from our mistakes and learn from, things that we've had to adjust. So thank you for sharing that.
It'd also be great to connect with people who are doing this, because again, it would be wonderful to be able to learn from what you're doing as well, and again, share anything that we have. So please reach out.
And while our attendees are thinking of questions, I just have a quick question myself. I'm just wondering if you drew inspiration from the world of public libraries. You sort of alluded to that, but I was wondering if you could speak to that a little more, because sometimes I feel like they do a lot of great social justice work and are work so intimately with their communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my paper, which was sort of like, so I wrote the paper in 2013, and that was sort of like a theoretical. I wasn't working in libraries. I was still in library school. It was theoretical. And so this project was sort of the initial like creation of it. But in the paper, actually, I talk about a couple public libraries that are doing sort of collecting stories from their communities and doing projects where they like stand up. I know a lot of libraries in Scandinavia do this, but some public libraries in the US where they have sort of like a booth where folks can go in and they can like on the spot record their history, they can record how they feel about something happening, and then they create, there are places where you can listen to it along the way. I believe also NPR and their StoryCorps initiative, I reflect on that in the paper as well. So you're absolutely right, like public libraries, because they're so, and I actually came from the world of public libraries initially. I worked at public libraries before, and I worked in a community public library for a historically a Black community. So these, the libraries are so tuned in, and so I definitely like pulled from that as far as the theory goes for how libraries could do this. And so this project was great to look at the experience of what it might look like for academic libraries, which is different.
Yes, thank you. And we have not a question, but a comment. It says, I can relate to the tension between the static digitized collections and the active born digital collections. This is something we're also talking about at San Jose State.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like we're seeing more and more active collections where we're, again, having to think about our systems and our models for doing things. But this one was really in particular pushed me to think a lot about how we, even the systems I've put into place for the work that we're doing, how it needs to change and evolve to fit more of this model.
I'll read another comment. I just want to say how impressed and inspired that you both managed to get buy-in from so many different departments, colleges, offices, etc., across the university. I'm curious, was this culture of collaboration pre-existing on UC San Diego's campus? I have never seen such a successfully expansive project in all my years as a professor at various universities and colleges for the past 10 years, which is high praise.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I mentioned this a little, and so Christella has been at UC San Diego more than I have, so I'll let her comment afterwards. But I will say that initially letting me, a temporary librarian, start this project, I think that does speak to the culture of collaboration at UC San Diego. And I think more importantly, it was the feeling within the department I was in. So my supervisors, my department, like they were very willing to let me like run with it. But also, and I'm gonna like toot my horn a little because it was a lot of work to strategize and make sure all the different people were involved, because I felt an extra pressure as a temporary librarian to make sure that like I had all my ducks in a row, because like I knew at any moment someone could shut the project down, someone could shut me down, I could like potentially maybe lose my job. Like I had all these things at the forefront of my mind. And so I made sure that like I knew, you know, again, like Gayatri was really great at like getting things done quickly and events, and she was really good at like pulling people together and like talking to people around the library. She was very social and like knew people. Christella was like amazing with like the digital content, and like she has a really great way of adding a critical eye to everything, which I appreciate. Like her perspective is like it like things I would never have thought of about like especially like continuing things down the line. So she added that point of view. Getting Rachel involved. She was a library assistant, but very enthusiastic and like loved the project and what it stood for, always doing things like this on campus and had been there a long time. So again, these project roles were super important in setting up the framework. And I think because we had that and we connected with the people we needed to in the very beginning, and also again connected it to the goals of the institution, the library, it really helped facilitate all of that. And then the last thing I'll say before I give it to Christella is that frequently what we heard when we started and got word out about the project was, oh my gosh, we've been wanting something like this for a very long time, but we could never like take the time or get it off the ground. Or so I think that also played a part in it as well, and the times that we created it in, which was the election.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add, I definitely think, you know, that list of sort of ingredients for success really speaks to sort of like how the project was able to succeed, and what Tamara was saying about each project team member bringing their strengths and expertises to the project. I will also credit Tamara for having just that enthusiasm and like bringing, you know, her skill set, her enthusiasm. I think some of us had already been, you know, working in the library for a while and felt entrenched with all the stuff that we're already doing. And so I know at first, when I first heard about this, I thought, oh, this is so ambitious. This is like such a short timeline. You know, we all have how much work on our plates. How are we going to get this done? But I think because of the moment, you know, again, because it was 2016 and there just was a lot of political tensions in the air, we felt compelled to do this. Like we really felt like it was important. And I hope, you know, that we all still feel that way today and keep going, because there is so much that's going on. It's really, I think, allowed for a lot of people to feel involved and engaged and to think about things that, you know, they didn't know. Again, I think there's a reason why the timeline is so fascinating, is that people really are interested in what came before them, what the campus, how it developed to be what it is today. And there was a lot of information that, again, was out there, but maybe not compiled. And so it was definitely, it pushed me to think differently about my role in terms of like, I think we often have like a more passive way of working with things. Things come to the library and then we're the ones handling them. And so this was a very different approach, having to actively say, we're going to create this timeline. We're going to take the stuff we've already got and put it out there in a different way. So it was a big shift. I mean, it's definitely been also a slow evolution. Like it seems like a fast timeline, but really, like, you know, there's been times when we've all said we've got a lot on our plates. So, you know, how can we do this event, but make it as lightweight as possible? So I think, you know, if you look at our digital collection, you'll see the types of events that we're doing and how we're able to leverage what we already have. So we usually are often using kind of slide decks that we've already had. We're just tailoring them to the specific event. We're thinking of new prompts, but we're doing just those quick post-it note feedback. So it's lightweight and a little bit easier and more nimble and flexible. So it's not as challenging to take on. It's kind of like, hey, who's free and available to do this event? That kind of thing. So it's been a great, I mean, again, it's been a pretty incredible project to be a part of.
Great, thank you. And I'll ask two questions. One is sort of a broad question and one is a more narrow technical question. The first is, What would you want to share with administrators and managers about how to support and direct sustained resources towards efforts like this? And the second question is a question about why you moved from Omeka to KNIT. This is the first I heard about KNIT, so I'm curious about its functionality.
I don't know, should we do all right, I'll answer the first one about, hold on, I'm looking also so I can
Yeah, I'm having trouble
what would
seeing.
you want to share with administrators and managers?
Managers, how to support and direct sustained resources towards efforts like this.
So I don't know, as far as resources go, again, we just use the resources that were already there. So, you know, we had printers, we had poster printers, which is how we printed our banners. We, you know, we try to use as much as possible that, I mean, we already had for outreach events, we already had like tabletop things, we already had a table. We did have to do, and I think, and I'll keep going back to this, is of like aligning it to our goals. You know, institutional, library, but also departmental. So because I was in the instruction environment, because I'm a liaison, you know, we do outreach. So how do I frame this project in the frame of like outreach? So, oh, we need to get banner stands for these banners, and other people can use them for their outreach as well. Okay, well, we'll spend the money to buy these banners because it'll benefit the entire program. As far as time goes, I think, I don't know if I could speak to this, maybe my supervisor should, but I mean, I don't know, we're very autonomous where we are. Like, as long as we're getting our work done, we can do what we'd like. And I feel like, you know, I'm still already tackling this plus my other work. So, and I will be completely honest, there are times when I'm like overwhelmed and, you know, we have to put this on the back burner for a little bit and come back to it. And also sort of like break down tasks. So like, oh, if we had 10 minutes, what could we like mess with for a little bit? But I also think because now that, again, it's tied to the goals and now it's tied to like the EDI goals on campus, that I think that, you know, we're going to get more support for it and we have more support for it and we're going to be able to leverage that because now they're using that as a way of communicating to the larger institution that the library is doing something towards this goal. Well, if that's the case, what can we, you know, can we get support for this? Can we get support for that? So I think, again, tying it to goals and like job responsibilities, I think that's the best way on your end. You know, Christella, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, you know, we do have processes and procedures in place for a reason. So I know when we submitted the formal project proposal to make this a collection in our digital collections website, our digital collections group, which is made up of different people in the library, did review it and discuss it. And, you know, they asked good questions. They kind of pushed us to think about like some of the sustainability issues and how this would grow and, you know, who would be doing what work. And so I think there's a level of support of thinking through critically and pointing out things to be concerned about, but then also offering support and saying like, okay, so how would this, you know, work? How can we do this? And having that sort of like perspective of let's make this work instead of like the defeatist sort of like this can't work, you know, like I think that was a really important mind shift that I will say that I'm very happy that we do have administrators that support us in that way. But it hasn't been easy, you know, it's been some tough conversations. Again, we've had to think really carefully. I think, you know, we're always concerned about, you know, like, is this going to help dialogue and conversation, or is this going to create, you know, aggravate or frustrate, you know? So like our timeline, I mean, we're pointing to a lot of very sort of poignant things. We're not like shying away from some of the university's sort of moments where there was tensions. There are examples of conflict, and I think that's always a risk. And so I appreciate that our administrators are so far have been very supportive of us, because we need that when we go out there. You know, that's while we're the face of the project and putting our ideas and thoughts out there, we need some support as well. So that's important, I think, for administrators.
And I think it helped that we started small. And I think that's another point, is that we initially, this is a pilot project. We're just doing from start to finish, we're doing the exhibit and that's the end of it. But then we just let it grow organically. And I think that's where more of the stability and the support came in as well.
And as far as KNIT goes, I know we're running out of time, but I'll just say, yes, so KNIT is what we're calling our local instance of Commons in a Box, but the tool, the platform is called Commons in a Box, and it was developed by CUNY. And it's basically WordPress, so it's just WordPress features, but there's also the option on the back end to have like a private group where you can have discussion boards, you can post things to each other that's not publicly available. So there's a lot of different collaborative dimensions to it. Again, you can kind of have some options on what's publicly available, what's just available to the group. So I think it has a lot of potential. We've just started to explore it. We've been running it for a few years now, and there's different campus groups that are using it. It's supported by our campus IT. It started in the library and then it shifted. That time when we needed it, it was shifting to the campus IT. So we're just starting to learn about what its features are, and I hope that it grows as a tool, it grows in use. So I'm happy to talk further or share if anyone wants to reach out, do a demo, show it to you. Just let me know.
And also, so as far as the reason why we shifted, so Emeka, Christella mentioned this, it was really great to just get it up and like stand it up. But then once we were going through it, like she's mentioned, our stats were showing that folks weren't going into it. And so I re-looked at the site and like the usability and the user experience of it was not great. And it also didn't reflect our project. Our project was like lively and visual and colorful and like it had a lot of collaboration to it, but the platform didn't support any of that. And so that's why the WordPress, we like the themes and we're still like she said, exploring that. But that's the why of why we shifted over.
Well, thank you both. I think we're close to time, but I just wanted to read one more comment. It says, I think you should take and own credit for the exceptional diplomatic organizing and leadership skills and talents that enabled these expansive collaborations, which I think is a good way to end this wonderful webinar.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tamara and Christella, for taking the time to share insight into your strategies and thinking critically to design a living community archive at the UC San Diego Library. Thank you also to both Marie and Marlena for facilitating this webinar, and thank you all for taking time to participate in today's webinar. Last, if you have a minute to spare, we'd really welcome your feedback through a quick survey that will pop up following this presentation. And if you have any suggestions for our next or future webinars, please feel free to weigh in. Thank you all so much, and please take care.